other thinkers like his contemporaries such as Hannah Arendt, for example, who believe that there is something positive in power, that there is something positive that the government can achieve in a society which is basically a cluster of uncounted minorities. It's a society of absolutely unaccountable for, or unaccounted for. And in those societies in which minority is not a number, society in which the majority is not a number, where majoritarian domination is a technique of domination, where the majority wields the power way disproportionate to actually its numerical count. In those societies, power can have, in fact, the government can have a kind of power that has a positive content to it. There is another sort of pessimism which Ambedkar is a part of, and that pessimism goes back to the Buddhist tradition and comes down to Ambedkar himself. In the middle, there are a cluster of thinkers around the world. You could think of James Baldwin, you could think of Toni Morrison, you could think of Frantz Fanon, and so you could think of W.E.B. Du Bois. There are several thinkers in which this pessimism takes another form, and that form argues for positing not the striving for life, but the ubiquity of death as the center of political action. The idea of the idea of mortality, the idea of death as constitutive of politics, and most importantly, the singularity of a particular form of dying. This is not to say that other forms of suffering are not important for Ambedkar, or other forms of slavery and enslavement are not important for someone like Du Bois or Baldwin, or that other forms of colonial incarcerations are not important for Frantz Fanon, who writes primarily about the French colonial brutality in Algeria and North Africa. What it is a case for is an argument that in the end, Dalit death has to be posited as the center of our political and democratic theory. That it is not simply living on, it is not simply living by any means, because that always benefits the Brahminic order. On the contrary, it is the sheer ubiquity of Dalit death that has to be made the center of our political theorizing. And from there ensues some of Ambedkar's most startling insights into what he believes India might, what he prophetically argues India might get wrong. And does India get them comprehensively wrong today? It clearly does. If there is any positive lesson to be drawn from the remarkable drive to appropriate Ambedkar by the Hindu right, it is that in the end, some of his lessons, some of his arguments are proving to be so ineluctable that even they can't ignore it. And among those, I think, which ironically the Hindu right would not actually agree with, is Ambedkar's description of politics as this relentless struggle between what is seemingly modern and what is profoundly archaic about India. That which refuses to leave us, that which returns to us in ever more brutal forms, in ever more cruel forms, every time we have gloated in the triumphant idea that we have left it behind. And a pandemic is all it takes to bring that sort of truth about the weakness and the fragility of our constitutional order. Ambedkar is clearly one of the great constitutional theorists of our time, of the last century. But what makes him great is not the idea that he will cling on to the Constitution as if it was an idol. Constitutional idolatry is not something that Ambedkar is very fond of. In fact, he's not fond of any idolatry, but constitutional ones especially, because it becomes a ruse, that sort of celebration of a document as if it were static and unchanging, that every generation, that every minority should be disabled from seeing and writing the constitution that it wants, is somehow antithetical to democracy itself. And it is to that idea that he most relentlessly returns. The idea that the Constitution will not save us unless we are prepared to save the Constitution. In fact, the paradox of all democracy is that it is precisely in moments of constitutional crisis that democratic courage makes its most forceful appearance. That somewhere, if there is something to be understood and there's something to be grasped from this moment, and from this moment where we find ourselves in the throes of yet another all-encompassing pessimism, moral and political pessimism, it is that Ambedkar always believed that pessimism has two threads running right through it: that of a constitutional crisis, and that which that crisis marshals, which is our democratic courage. Now, constitutional crisis is something that to us sounds like it is of a moment. It sounds to us like we came to it after 1950, after we became a constitutional republic. But for Ambedkar, the word constitution itself, which is very central to his conception of political courage, and in the end to his conception of freedom. What is a constitution? And this is where I find him to be almost ridiculously inappropriable, because he is ridiculously prophetic about it. What is a constitution if it's not simply a document? If the logical argument is that every generation should be allowed to amend and write its constitution, that we should not be bound by a constitution or by a penal code that criminalizes homosexuality, or that does not give women the right over their own bodies, that does not let us marry people from other castes or regions, then we ought to change something. So what in that sense remains of a constitution? Ambedkar's answer in a 1943 essay on Gandhi, Rana Day, and Jinnah is the constitution is not a guarantee of any sort of reform. The constitution is our relationship to political truth. That is what the constitution is. Our relationship to political truth. And truth, it becomes political precisely when it is not religious truth anymore, not simply a vacuous sort of moral relativism anymore, where everyone says, as liberals who champion difference often says, let everyone practice their own truth. That's not political truth. That could be an individualistic conception of moral truth. But what makes truth political is simply this idea. And here we see traces of that philosophical pessimism we began with. Our refusal to succumb or submit ourselves to a regime of lying, to a government that lies. To a government that lies, the Constitution can never have any true value. To be politically truthful is to have that courage to tell the government that it is engaged in an act of perjury. That remarkable line in 1943, remarkably succinct, where Ambedkar says, "The secret of freedom is courage." And courage is born from a combination of individuals into a party. That is to say, courage, another name for courage could simply be solidarity. The antithesis of solidarity is not, however, mere atomism or individualism. The antithesis of our solidarity, if it goes missing, he says, is pity. And all we are left with in that situation is a condition of moral outrage. That is why courage matters. Not because it allows everyone to nourish their own truth, but because it produces a solidarity which allows the people to resist a government and a regime that lies. Traces of this idea are to be found in Ambedkar's most brilliant essay, and as I often say, this is possibly the most brilliant student essay ever written. The most brilliant essay ever written by a student, which is his 1916 essay, Caste in India, which he wrote as an MA student at Columbia University in New York. And there, Ambedkar has an insight about why we become, or we risk becoming, a society completely devoid of truth tellers. That is because, he says very simply, that is because in our society, rumor can often take the place of truth with an effortless ease. We are a society that is governed, the caste society, is governed not by truth, but by rumor. And to understand our constitutional crisis is to first go to that moment in this young graduate student in New York who writes about rumor. And it's, in 2016, when it struck me, and I was in Johannesburg at the Indian consulate, which had hosted the 125th anniversary lecture. Indian consulates all over the world, as we are aware, were hosting Ambedkar lectures because it was the 125th year of Ambedkar. He was born in 1891, as we know. And one of the remarkable things about that moment was that it was also, and yet completely ignored, because it is in the interest of people in power to not read Ambedkar, even as they celebrate Ambedkar. And to everyone who sits there and reads Ambedkar, you are a Democrat. And that is a fact. Because that is what strikes you about 2016, when we were busy, government, consulates, embassies, world over, in New York, in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, in Singapore, we're busy organizing these 125th anniversary lectures. It was conveniently forgotten that it was the 100th year of caste in India, his 1916 essay. And in the interest of time, I want to end there with that essay, because 3 or 4 interesting strands are remarkably brilliant for a graduate student. And I've always believed that students are smarter than we are, that pull these threads together. The first is, as I was saying, Ambedkar's idea of rumor, which is simply a crisis produced in our way of living truthfully, in which hearsay has taken the place of facts. And this is why this becomes so prophetic. As he says, in India, a rumor does 2 things. It produces or gives rise to a new caste, because every time you touch something impure, you are excommunicated. The result is a new caste. So the infinite reproducibility of an order of oppression depends on nothing but mere rumor. And even more remorselessly, a rumor in India alone can a rumor have you killed. Not simply excommunicated, not simply banished, not simply outlawed. A rumor can have you killed. There could be a rumor of beef in your refrigerator, for example, and it can have you killed. And this is simply a problematic that goes to the heart of the matter of what we have often argued about Ambedkar. We have often argued about Ambedkar that he's a thinker who is interested simply in restitution by governmental means, who's interested simply in a welfarism that gives undue, even disproportionate advantages to the minorities. What we forget in this particular way in which he articulates the problem of power, in which he articulates the problem of discipline, is this, that Ambedkar in the end remains perhaps in the 20th century, in the 19th, if you add Marx to it, among the two most important thinkers of the majority. It is not the minority that for Ambedkar is the real problem of democratic practice and culture, or even democratic mentality. The minorities, he says, are not there to ask for things. They will cease to exist. They will happily dissolve themselves the day the majority dissolves its own prejudice. Minorities exist only because the majority wants them to exist. And I want us to end by simply this insight about democratic courage, to call out what is the most ubiquitous, the most tangible, and yet the most untheorizable aspect or dimension of the Indian majority. That the Indian majority is not a number, it is a technique. That there is something like a machine, or what he calls in 1916, a mechanism in the way the Indian majority is constituted. And it is constituted across the political spectrum, because this is not a political majority. You could count a political majority. What this majority is a communal technique. It rules invisibly. It rules not by numbers, it rules not by law, it rules by prejudice. Prejudices that go to the heart of our civilizational values. And this is why Ambedkar was such a fierce critic of all ideas of India. He wasn't interested in ideas of India, because all ideas of India were in the end civilizational ideas of India. They were Brahminic ideas of India. As he says, Indian liberals have somehow bought into a colonial form of Orientalism that the Dark Age started with the Muslim invasions of the subcontinent. It was not the Islamic invasions. The Dark Age of India goes centuries earlier than that, where every possibility of political emancipation was theoretically curtailed. This is why the Manusmriti, which he burns in 1927 during the Mahar Satyagraha, he calls a work of genius. He calls it a work of genius because it does everything without saying anything about those it affects the most. The Manusmriti is a catalog of injunctions without any determinate subject. It is so brilliant that it produces new minorities by simply new forms and new acts of lying and rumor. And that is what has completely broken in our moment, where even the courts, the judges, will not come to the defense of what could be seen, what is simply basic constitutional dignity, let alone constitutional truth. What has broken down today in India's remarkably unbridled brutality towards minorities is that relationship to truth, to courage, and to a form of government which is not simply political or bureaucratic government, but the government of our everyday life, self-government. That we have today lapsed into a form of self-government that decides or has decided in the end to rule by the power simply of rumor. That is where Ambedkar's pessimism comes from, but that is also where his argument about democratic courage comes from. So I'll stop there. I think I've exceeded the time that both Dickens and Jyotsna would require, but also the time that Anjana had asked me to stick to. So yeah, I should stop.
Thanks, Anjana. You'll have to probably unmute your mic.
Professor Dickens. Yeah. Hello, we can't hear you, Professor Dickens.
Dr. Ambedkar often talked of tyranny of majority before independence and after independence. How do you look at this development at present?
Sorry, is this I seem to is this a question addressed to or Dickens? Have you started? I have lost.
No, we'll have to keep questions towards the end because that might be eating into the time of our other speakers.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Professor Kumar. Now we'll listen to what Professor Dickens has to say, and he'll be speaking on three instances in Ambedkarite thought. So thank you so much, Professor Kumar, and over to you, Professor Dickens. So if everybody could just pin Professor Dickens onto the screen, yeah, and I'll mute myself and speak. Professor Dickens, you need to unmute your mic. We can't hear you. We can't hear you. You need to unmute your mic.
Who's the third speaker? Oh, sorry.
I just spoke to Professor Leonard Dickens. There seems to be some problem with the system. So he asked us to go ahead with the next speaker, and he'll join us in a bit. So the next speaker we have for today is Ms. Jyotsna Siddharth. So if everybody could pin Jyotsna Siddharth to the screen. Jyotsna, could you test your mic once for us, please?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, all's
Yes.
good. So we'll be muting our mics henceforth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall
I'm sorry?
I begin? Am I audible?
Yes, yes, please, please.
Okay. Thank you, Anjana and Lamakaan, for having me here. And I'm sorry I joined the call when Professor Aishwary Kumar was almost ending, so I couldn't catch the whole talk. But I would, I'm here to speak about Ambedkar and their vision and ideas about annihilation of caste through intermarriage. And um, but I have engaged with the issue during my MPhil work as well, when I was looking at the issue of romantic love and intimacy, and how does caste feature into it. So, but this, for the purpose of this talk, my talk would not be very theoretical and academic in that sense, although I would draw some references from the ethnographies that I have read, and what Ambedkar had to say about intercaste marriage. So, just to begin, one of the things that Ambedkar proposed about annihilation of caste is through intermarriage, the intercaste marriage, and kind of breaking those caste strictures through breaking of endogamy, which essentially ensures that a caste has to marry within the same caste to ensure the purity of a particular caste. And essentially, what is being argued is that through intercaste marriage, there is a window or to put a dent or to annihilate caste. And and they also kind of then and I will not get into the legalities of Hindu Marriage Act and Hindu Code Bill, because I mean, these are things that one can read about. But what I want to discuss today is that the idea of intercaste marriage and how that has uh, although made some contribution, but today we see how intercaste marriage is also inflicting violence on the couples who get married in different caste, or who may not follow the traditional route to marriage or relationships or love. Um, and so the idea of intercaste marriage is very important, and a vision which is very important. And one of the routes that can bring about change is, I mean, it's also kind of given by Ambedkar, because it says that it 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 brings these different realities and caste and communities together, and it sort of enforces people who are involved in that sort of union to break those boundaries that are created by the caste system and the state, and how state visualizes marriage, which is essentially is also reproduction of labor and reproduction of caste in a certain way. So but then we see that today, couples who are getting married are also getting sanction from the state, which has given these schemes where intercaste couples get married, and government as a way to promote those alliances will either provide money or support or counseling, and um, just it kind of way to this tokenism to show that state also promotes intercaste alliances and marriages in a certain way. But we look at the work of Prem Chaudhary, who's written extensively about honor killings and how caste plays out when a couple decides to get married within the Gotra, and her work is largely in Haryana. And then we talk about V Geeta and Uma Chakravarti, who are also talking about, and at the same time, Sharmila Rege, who are also talking about that what is this relationship of gender and violence, intrinsic violence that is um, involved. Just the fact that two people fall in love and decide to either be together or get married, but then there is whole world that keeps coming crashing down, because it's not just love, it's not just a relationship, but it is also to be seen as a political act. It is those transgression of caste boundaries um, that that are hard to kind of control, because I mean one cannot see that as a rational act of transgression, but sort of more intimate and uh, something that is seen as is beyond oneself. So, on one hand, when Ambedkar, during their time, talking about intercaste marriage and seeing as a way to break the caste system, and it is definitely one of the ways, because when children are being born out of intercaste marriage and associations, what is their caste? And it kind of raises this ambiguity around. And of course, thanks to patriarchy, we assign caste of children to the caste of a father. So we would always kind of say, okay, a child will automatically take the caste of a father. But if that didn't have to happen, then the children do not have a caste, because or they have two different castes. So I mean these are like some of the questions, um, and then we also see how at time of marriage, you see there is this sense of resistance and retaliation that is being observed in the villages and communities, where the bridegroom would be put on a horse and with painted their face tag, or they would there's a whole display and a certain voyeurism around how we want to punish the bodies that transgress those caste boundaries, um, and go beyond the mandated sort of guideline that's been given by the caste system. So there is all those sort of display of violence, display of bodies in a certain way, um, and I think these are completely rooted in our brahminical understandings of how we see bodies, how we see desire, how we see what is aesthetic and what is beauty, and hence what are we attracted to, what are we not attracted to. So all those brahminical notions of beauty also make certain bodies more vulnerable and fetishized on, and certain bodies that are constantly ostracized and constantly boycotted. And I'm bringing in these elements because they all link to what constitutes our idea of love, what constitutes our idea of attraction, and what happens when two people and if you go by the idea that okay, one doesn't, everybody may or may not know which surname a person belongs to and what caste is it. So when two individuals meet, and they fall in love, there is that ambiguity of anonymity of not knowing what a person and what caste they belong to, and hence the possibilities of love and attraction comes in, and when love and attraction comes in, and then there is whole institution of marriage that comes in, and the legalization and legitimizing that romantic or sexual union, the state kind of comes in, and again state tells you that um like these certain alliances, although they try to protect and say, okay, we have legal measures, we are giving you schemes, and we will protect, but I think states understanding is also extremely heteronormative, and I'm only referring here to the Indian state, or whatever you may call it at present. um, and how does that see this whole heteronormative and monogamous Brahminical understanding of what marriage should be, and what kind of respect or honor those alliances should have or not have. And then you also see love jihad at the same time, where the alliance of Hindu Muslim marriage is being made political, and is completely kind of used it as a political weapon to communalize, and to use that as to spread hatred. So for then we see that it is like that point where it becomes extremely important to deliberate and have these conversations about why intercaste marriages are important, and why after all these years we still have very less, or very few, like I would say the percentage of intercaste marriages is still very low, and I'm trying to find the statistics here. I have it somewhere here. Um, so, according to Indian Human Development Survey, which was done by National Council of Applied Economic Research and University of Maryland, 5% of Indians have embraced intercaste marriage. So, after all these years, we see that um, there is no sort of, I mean, there is still very less percentage of people who are going forward and getting married out of choice, um, because an ethnography is a literature on love and intimacy also, and romantic relationship shows that often marriage and love is seen as something very say liminal or temporary. So it's only marriage which is seen as the finality of having a romantic of having a romance. So marriage is seen as more important than romance. So a lot of times family would still be okay to kind of accept intercaste love or relationship in some cases, but would not be okay to have intercaste marriage, because that moment is seen as a moment of finality, where all those transactions of property and women's product, labor and sexuality is kind of negotiated. Um, so that's that. And then just to also bring in what Sharmila Rege had kind of described, said in her book Against the Madness of Manu. Um, and I would just read from here that no one's private sphere, not even that of God's, is free from the critique. And like when she's talking about, like she's talking about the marriage and private sphere, and how, but I think that this is, let's come to that later. But there's often also this critique that people say that Ambedkar saw intercaste marriage as a way to annihilate caste, but that still hasn't happened. And in some ways, intercaste marriage hasn't been able to annihilate caste as it was proposed or visualized. So to that, I would say that it's been many, like it's been decades and decades when Ambedkar had written what they had written, and of course their writings still stand pertinent and very relevant today. But the complexity around relationships have become far more nuanced. I mean, when we look at the dating culture and dating apps today, there is this understanding that there is a lot of anonymity of regarding what one's caste is, and one can be completely anonymous and not share about what what caste they belong to, and they can happily just go online and meet whoever they wish and date. But through our work and engagement, one has seen that even the digital space is not as free and liberating as it seems, or as it appears to be, because uh, people bring in their socio-cultural political identities in whichever space they go to. Hence those boundaries and those negotiations around caste still remains, and sometimes it's harder to kind of negotiate because digital space has also been violent. So coming back to the point that um, complexities around love and romantic relationships have changed. If you look at the small cities and villages and towns, um, the anonymity again becomes less and less because everybody knows everyone, and any sort of romantic alliance is quickly known and quickly ostracized and punished, to the point. And I feel the punishment is not just because people don't want to kind of promote a particular alliance. It's also because intercaste marriages promote and promote a certain understanding which goes beyond what Indian society, that is essentially founded on the caste uh, s- uh, system, does not see. So there is that contradiction, um, that one is sort of constantly trying to push and ensure that the caste system continues to remain as it is. So yeah, I mean, these are some of the uh, um, aspects that I wanted to cover, and I think maybe I could take and elaborate more in the questions, and if that's okay, and maybe elaborate more if there is any specific issue or question that emerges, and yeah, I would stop here. Thank you.
All right. Right. Thank you, Jyotsna. We'll now have Professor Dickens. Professor Dickens, could you like test your mic, please?
Yeah.
You have to unmute your mic. It's muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, super.
Perfect. All right.
Yeah. Thank you, Anjana, for this wonderful time of sharing space with everyone at Lamakaan. I also thank the early speakers who have set up the event very well with their talk. Uh, I'd like to. This is as this talk is titled "Remembering Ambedkar on his Jayanti." I have titled the talk as three critical moments in Ambedkar. Now, Ambedkar's life and work has been referred and studied by many today. He has been a signpost for differential purposes, uh, be it that of a statesman or a constitutionalist, a politician, but also an intellectual par excellence, right? But also, on the other hand, he has been also reductively being touted as an untouchable and much worse as a Mahar, or on the other hand, or cheerfully as a Buddhist revolutionary and a renowned economist, and much so recently as a nationalist, firstly and lastly, as is, as been quoted. So his life had been framed, if not limited, by the gaze of his referees for a very long period now. However, my talk, I'm thinking of in the memories and practices of those hold him dear to their hearts. His life had always postured a limitless yield of possibilities, of meanings. So for instance, if even in this quarantine time, and if you see social media, there are a lot of a lot of statements which go around by quoting him, by referring him back. For instance, a slogan such as educate, agitate, and organize. It recurs as an echo, right? Continuously, as if it's a lasting command. So this paper or this talk, I try to think of Ambedkar's acoustic calls in particularly in most banners and posters that claim allegiance to Ambedkarite politics, but also have a life beyond their inscriptions. So would these slogans, through the Ambedkarite world, wording of the world, would they generate meanings beyond their limits? Do they communicate a complete message of what indeed was written as a fragment, educate, agitate, organize, and by chance? So, taking from Ambedkar's last message, it calls the untouchables, largely Dalits, to educate, agitate, and organize. I want to see these three terms as a prophetic command, which calls unto a kind of a hearing to his words that he left behind from this world. So Ambedkarites today largely read, write, recite, repeat, quote, and like we also discuss and reflect, if not only, but on his words largely. So he has also arguably created a community of readers and hearers, listeners.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you. There's quite a bit of static on your end.
Hello?
Hello?
You can't hear me?
There's a little bit of static here and there, which makes it a little difficult to listen to you.
Okay. Is this fine?
Yes. Yeah.
Is this fine? Okay.
Yes, much better. Yeah.
Just a minute. I just removed my earphone.
Oh,
Thank
all right.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm trying to do in this talk is to think of how to think about how to read his the world that he left behind, inspiring people to read him, which Professor Aishwary had actually cited, and also reading those whom he had read, and they, for instance, talking, I mean, like us talking about him, or also hearing and heeding unto him. What does it mean? In other words, can we say Ambedkar has also scripted, along with a prosaic constitution, perhaps a sonic world that hears him, and this demands an adequate interpretation of his wording of the world, and vice versa. So, in this attempt, I would discuss three critical moments in Ambedkar's journey and Ambedkarite thought as three critical stages that express an anti-caste event, which one can call as a becoming other than oneself, right? So these particular moments, which I call that recognizes, abolishes, and persuades, are particularly three speeches that Ambedkar gives at three different places during three different moments in his life, from the years 1916 to 1956. Now, each of these speeches are delivered in three different countries. They're separated by 20 years. Now, using this history of this weight of the slogan that I earlier cited, educate, agitate, and organize, I would like to firstly, foreground the seminar presentation that Aishwary cited, a seminar presentation at Columbia University, New York, North America, in May 1916, which tried to expose the human institution of caste for the first time as a moment that educates. Now, and secondly, after that, a speech in May 1936, which is 20 years after the 1916 speech, which apparently seconded, which is the second speech, which seconded the undelivered annihilation of caste speech. And this was a speech which insisted the Mahar conference to convert in Bombay, India. And I want to see this speech as a moment that agitates. And lastly, Ambedkar's last speech on Buddhism, which I want to try to see it as a critique, which was actually presented in the fourth conference of the World Fellowship of Buddhists in November 1956, again 20 years after 1936 at Kathmandu, Nepal. And I want to see this, understand this moment, this speech as a moment that organizes. So organizes this talk therefore interprets these three moments in consequence as signatory events and would wish to demonstrate how anti-caste events not only expose inscriptions of caste, but also creative stage acts of expression against caste, right? So now the first speech, which was at Columbia University, New York, at an anthropological seminar, uh, uh, was on 9th May 1916. Ambedkar was a 25-year-old graduate student. He was the first untouchable in history to have crossed oceans to study in a university of the colonial world when wars between worlds were rumbling in Europe. This was during the interwar, during the First World War. So this event is singularly inaugural because though Ambedkar's life was marked by multiple travels to hierarchical spaces of many a kind, but a sense of a place at home was only felt distantly, which was only felt at a distance. He writes in the Columbia University Alumni newspaper, December 1930, that he experienced social equality the first time in Columbia University. And some of his best friends that he had in life were some of his classmates and professors at Columbia. Now, in fact, Dalit travels resuscitate memories that embody the violence that is inscribed in a caste space that is homeland that was never homely to them. For Ambedkar, a sense of spatial homeliness and camaraderie, fraternity, was only felt outside home. Of course, this calls for a very different understanding. Indeed, to compare and evoke it again, singularly, it is only after a century later, yet another Dalit could get a PhD in anthropology from Columbia University to second Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. So in this context, in the context of warring colonial nations in Europe, Ambedkar for the first time presents an academic paper to the students of ethnology to expose the human institution of caste as inscribed in India. He uses inquisitive terms in the paper such as exhibition, explanation, evaluation, and analysis to recognize the containment of castes, which I would call in India, castes in India. The preposition in is academically exposed as a labor of love. This is his own words that he uses it as a labor of love in front of the university audience within four walls, which was largely white and American and also male. And he quotes, it was the wildest of ideas to expose caste. Personally engaging with different scholars such as Mr. Senat, Mr. Neffield, Sir H. Rinsley, and Ketkar, Ambedkar accounts as a 25-year-old graduate student, how thoughts on caste had been continuously confused, reduced, and often repeated. He indeed recognizes an inness and withinness that academics had fallen into by not studying caste in relation to a system. He ultimately rejects this enclosure, which he calls an encircling that thoughts on caste had created. An encircling that contains, without negating, the disembodied spirit. He quotes the ghostly presence of the Hindu lawgiver Manu. In a sense, Ambedkar exorcises this spirit by recognizing its containment, which, I quote, imitates, innovates, and excommunicates violently, and ultimately exposes through the speech the enclosures that had closed others out. In this interesting first event, Ambedkar clarifies that descriptions are not explanations. And this moment that educates largely is premised on right investigation so as to arrive at a serviceable truth, with his own words. So he advances a theory of caste, which he says, if untenable, will give itself up, or so he concludes. So this first labor of love, that moment that educates, a moment that educates, which recognizes caste as an inscriptive problem in Ambedkar, which he calls a falsehood, which necessitates an academic exposure that the young graduate student Ambedkar as a 25-year-old young man does far away from home. Now, while the first event, which I call, which gives us an idea of educators or the idea of education for us, is animated in our memory as an academic journey of sorts in a foreign land, particularly in USA. Whereas my second speech, which I'd be thinking here aloud, is by a 45-year-old Ambedkar, who's already a recognized leader of the oppressed and suppressed classes of India. He had by now represented the untouchables in London, in the roundtable conferences in London. He had famously opposed Gandhi and Gandhiism by dwelling critically on the Pune Pact as a compromise. This was in the year 1932 to 1935, and by the separate electorates as a law was lost out. So in this context, an agitated Ambedkar had momentously stated that he will not die as a Hindu. This was in 1935 at the Yola conference. So it was also in this context that a caste reform society by caste Hindus, the now famous Jat Paat Todak Mandal and Annihilation of Caste speech, which went undelivered, had invited Dr. Ambedkar to address their conference in Lahore on caste. And very famously, Ambedkar came up with a revolutionary speech, which was never delivered, a speech that was never allowed to be heard by caste ears, a speech which I would call that escaped an anti-caste hearing, a speech that still seeks an embodied delivery. So the speech in its unheard, undelivered form, as a printed book, had indeed generated wide and serious response, particularly that of Gandhi. Of course, a textual agitation as abolition, that is printed words that annihilate caste, had been inscribed and circulated. However, this particular idea of annihilation of caste speech had to wait as a speech for a different audience, in a different space, and in a different language to be delivered. In fact, it had to convert into a speech that converts. So this speech, which I'd be looking now, is in Marathi, now available in English, translated by Leonard Dickens. Which this speech comes as a second speech to the undelivered annihilation of caste. And this speech insisted the Mahar Conference on 31st May 1936 in Bombay to convert and to move away from Hindus. So this is the title of text that was later written down elaborately and published in English. So this was addressed to Mahars, the untouchable Marathi-speaking community to which Ambedkar belonged to. And Ambedkar in the speech likens himself to a boatman who necessarily sets on a voyage, making preparation to reach the other shore. So the word is in the word away, a command to act. So Chaudhary, in another particular context, actually discusses incisively on the idea of being away from Hindus, precisely as an act of abandoning by the abandonment, or much dramatically, if I may, one can say it was considered as an annihilation by the annihilated. But it is towards reaching the ground of the other shore, which leaves no ground for fault finders, moving away towards conversion. So realizing the responsibility towards a change of name as a change in religion, Ambedkar floats an interesting theory of names which agitates the value of what he calls distinction with a difference. In other words, he calls untouchables must seek a distinction that is distinctly convert before becoming different. So this distinctly different name would establish a kinship, a community fellowship beyond the social relationship, which frees them of Maharki or Maharvatan, that is to give and to take and to participate in sympathetic resentment, where emotions and anger are compounded together in the generation of life. In other words, this abolishing act, that moving away from the Hindus, was also an abolishing act of inscribed names, of being called an untouchable through conversion, which may create, which he calls a revolution in the status of the untouchables, which this makes them distinctly different from being isolated or discriminated against or having no friends. Thus, for Ambedkar, the name matters and matters a great deal, and which wills to speak or name without fear or favor. Now, as I move to the third part, while the second speech can be understood as a speech on agitation, which particularly thinks about moving away from a shore towards another shore. The third and last speech, which I would call the last speech, which was given at Kathmandu, Nepal, in the fourth World Fellowship of Buddhists on 20th November 1956, was by an ailing 65-year-old Baba Sahib, nearing his death in 3 weeks. And the biennial Buddhist conferences were earlier organized in Colombo, Sri Lanka in 1950, in Japan in 1952, particularly in Tokyo, and Rangoon, Burma in 1954. So Ambedkar had visited the first conference in Colombo, which was in Sri Lanka, and had in passing compared Buddhism and communism. Now, at Kathmandu too, he is requested by the audience to talk on the same matter on the last day. A month earlier, in October, Ambedkar had just led a mass conversion of 5 lakh Dalits into Buddhism. It had been the single most defining moment of conversion in history outside Hinduism. Now, Ambedkar had also been by then acclaimed for his immense contribution as a chief architect of the Indian Constitution, but had also by now resigned himself from parliamentary affairs. In the context of a changing post-war world order that had disordered the very constitutions of the nations, Ambedkar's speech speaks outside India for a world fellowship. Now, the content of the speech makes up the posthumously published text titled Buddha at Karl Marx, but a 3-minute fragment of the same and a transcribed text of the full speech is available now in the World Wide Web. The speech envisages a labor to make people hear, a critique so as to organize. It demonstrates the persuasive work of a conjunction, the conjunction or, an alternative possibility of organizing the world that a particular word can do. The conjunction or here in the title of text, Buddha or Karl Marx. Without any shortcuts, without any rush, by embarking the long, devious route to safely land on sound ground, Ambedkar becomes a student of both Buddha and Marx and expose each other to their limits. This is an act of exscription, one might call, that continuous reading and writing unto itself, which generates meaning at its limit so as to discharge and unburden new meaning. So this persuasion towards opening the limits, opening, say for example, Buddha to the other of Marx, Ambedkar says this persuasion can organize. He tells the contemporary antique outsiders, that displaced person who has lost his home, within quotes. So and it organizes them into a body of life, and for him a sangha without bloodshed or dictatorship. But he insists in the speech that this is a labor that should continuously dig into the ears of the people. It is never still or silent like the bhikkhus who sit and read in isolation. This is an act, an organic act which persuades, I quote, the methods of love, justice, and goodwill. Thus, this practice of hearing, this is a particular idea of hearing, critiques the policing force, a force that polices to act in a particular way, to slowly disappear in order to organize a body to persuasion. So to conclude, desiring a becoming other than caste, other than itself as caste, one of our friends, Rohit Vimala, had undepartingly scripted a movement from shadows to stars in his death. Anti-caste events. That was an anti-caste event. Anti-caste events, even deaths, not only expose inscriptions of caste, but also creatively stage acts of expressions against caste. So this talk discussed 3 particular critical moments in Ambedkar's journey, and Ambedkar thought as 3 critical stages that recognizes the illness of caste, abolishes or move away from caste, but also persuade a world outside caste. Through particular 3 speeches by Ambedkar, 3 different places during the years 1916 to 1956, from America to India in a Mahad conference to a World Buddhist conference in Nepal. So by in larger conclusion, by education through Ambedkar, one exposes the illness of caste, and by agitation, one distinctly differs oneself from caste, and by organization, one persuades a conjunctural world where more than one world meets other worlds to connect outside and beyond caste. So this has to be done almost anywhere and anytime. So thank you for this opportunity.
Right. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Dickens. I'm sure that people have some questions that they'd like to ask each of our speakers. So what I think would be easier to avoid static and to avoid a lot of noise is if anybody who has a question just posts it in the chat box, and the respective speakers will answer them as you type them out. So you can keep your questions brief and concise, and that's what we'll do. Also, do let us know who your question is for. Okay. Professor Dickens, a question for you is to reflect upon, just a minute, upon the news of arrests today. If you could just speak about the arrests which took place today.
So, should we take the questions together? Should we take the questions together, or?
No, we'll take them as we go along because I think people are typing them out.
Okay, okay.
So,
So absolutely, I've known Professor Teltunde for a long time. He's a very good friend and supporter is one of the most active minds that we have in the anti-caste movement. And the arrest is a certain kind of which was already theatrically happening for the last 6 months at least. Not necessarily only Professor Teltunde here, but also others. So our and to fall back on Ambedkar, this is the moment, perhaps to organize and speak out. And I just read Professor Tiltunde's letter on the wire to the people of India, where he himself asked people to speak out. Unless we all become victim when it all reaches to us. So I think taking what I've been thinking about, what Aishwary is doing, and what other Jyotsna people like Jyotsna are doing, is to actually make it out across and not be succumbed by by the by the status acts, policing forces. If you want to cite that actually impinge silence as a mode of or silencing or violating one's right to speak as a kind of limiting that mind to work. So I think we are at the right moment where it is necessary for us, while we are quarantined and while we are being distanced, for us to actually organize through different means to make a mind such as Professor Tiltunde to speak out, to come out and support him in solidarity, and support him to bring him out of the jail as soon as possible. That would be my immediate response, because it's a numbing moment for most of us who have known Professor Tiltunde, and his writings. So I think the moment is for us to speak, for us to write and organize much more concretely.
all right, thank you. So if people would prefer to ask questions instead of typing them out, you could just unmute your mic. I'll see them in the chat box and you can go ahead and ask your question. But please keep them brief because I don't know how many people are comfortable typing them out. So if somebody would like to ask them out loud instead, that's fine. Once. All right, so Rani Thomas has a question for Dr. Aishwary Kumar. His question, Professor Kumar, is: do you think Ambedkar as a philosopher is part of many universities now? Rani, the person who's asking the question, Rani Thomas, says that he teaches sociology in Delhi University, and it's only recently that the university included Ambedkar in syllabus. It would be very informative to know from you the ways in which Ambedkar as a philosopher is part of the university syllabi in the US, especially philosophy departments. Yeah.
it's actually a great question. It's also a very big question, and it's difficult to. I mean, I could make some quick remarks on this, because part of why he's not read has something very fundamental to do with how philosophy or the history of political thought or political theory itself, and in the end, our very relationship to democracy is constituted. There is absolutely no form of democracy that does not actually involve some relationship to, and therefore depends on the classroom and what we teach and how we teach it. Part of why Ambedkar, and you would know this, we all would, that part of why Ambedkar was resisted actively, and by resistance I mean actively resisted by scholars and political figures, people outside of academic life who thought and wrote about politics as well. Part of why he was resisted through that broad swath of people interested in thinking about politics is simply because, as I was saying, he was not interested in civilizational ideas of politics and of nation states. And I think the emergence in the 1980s of what came to be called post-colonial theory had a dramatic impact, a negative impact on the way he was read, because it suddenly became fashionable to critique everything that seemed European, or as a cliche, everything that was Western. And Ambedkar, whose thought was truly planetary in scope, was simply not the figure that they could wholly contend with, let alone actually think through. And those categories that he thought through, most importantly of caste. Now, what is interesting about Ambedkar's critique of caste, and I think this needs to be stated as simply as it can be, that for him, any conception of Indian political mentality that does not see caste as central and constitutive, or sees caste simply as a social question, is delimiting, is oppressive. And I think once you really come to terms with how sweeping and how unavoidable that claim is, it becomes difficult to read or understand caste in any other way than what Ambedkar's way was, his own way. And so post-colonial theory, which was mostly invested in critiques of European Enlightenment, critiques of Western science, critiques of Western power and knowledge, empire, and so on, somehow found Ambedkar to be extremely difficult. Now, the casualty here is not simply caste politics, but any form of political theory that posits the minority to be the center of our democratic struggle. Think of, for example, the 1990s. The Babri Masjid comes down. It comes down on Ambedkar's, 6th December, which is Ambedkar's death anniversary. The atrocity is timed in a particular manner, not deliberately, perhaps some will argue, but it was timed. Just as Anand's arrest today has been very, very significantly, astutely, remorselessly timed. There is a timing to atrocity. And the 1990s were a particular kind of time. So if you read what comes out from the entire swath of liberal intelligentsia, and I'm not using liberal simply as people who identify themselves as such. I'm speaking of a kind of philosophical liberalism that is enmeshed with Indian nationalism. That kind of liberal framework, when it could have done with Ambedkar most rigorously, when it should have read Ambedkar most rigorously, because here is a thinker who actually anticipates something like an attack on a 16th century mosque. He does not say it in as many terms, but throughout his writings, the idea that the majority in India will lay to ruin every single standing sign of what is truly Indian, that is truly anti-civilizational about India, comes true in the 90s. And yet through the 90s, there's a kind of deafening silence around Ambedkar. And the question then is, why would people who could have, in their critique of Hindu fundamentalism or fascism, gained so much by reading someone like Ambedkar, say philosophy of Hinduism, copies of which were burnt by the Shiv Sena and generally in Maharashtra when it was published by the government of Maharashtra in the 80s. Why is this thinker so obdurately resisted? And I think part of why he's resisted is because he thinks of a political philosophy for Indian democracy in which the critique of majoritarian power is the first step. Ambedkar is the only thinker, and because you ask about US departments, think of the much larger tradition in south of England, in Europe, in United States. One of the absences in normative political philosophy is that it has no theory of majority. It just does not. There's a principle of the majority decision in democracy, as we know, but there is no actual reasoning as to why the majority should always be taken to be right, other than the basic fact that more people suddenly start to believe in a lie. That does not make it a truth. And if you read Ambedkar and the resistance to Ambedkar both together in a dialectic, you realize that here is a thinker who anticipates what we will eventually call in our own time fascism or populism. The idea, what is today's populism? It's the revolt of that very class and caste groups or racial groups that have benefited the most from global inequality and neoliberal economies. That sort of critique of the majority that rules not by principle but by lying, it just does not believe in fact, in other words, everywhere, wherever it is resurgent. That form of critique that Ambedkar has of the majority is, I believe, well ahead of its time. You go back to the 19th century, you come down to the 20th century, and this is not true of just academic discourses. This is true of political discourses. This is true in journalism, where he was simply not a figure at all in the 90s. Even though caste movements were resurgent, you could see this prejudice simmer up in largely northern Indian or urban Indian resistance to enfranchisement and democratization in northern India, across states where Dalit parties came to power or lower caste parties came to power, and so on. So there is, to come back to your main question, there are two ways in which this can be read. One, that Ambedkar's critique of the majority as always a civilizational majority, as a communal technique of domination, puts him way ahead of time and what we like to call ahead of the curve in the history of political theory at large. And that resistance is endemic to Indian academic and political thinking. But it is also not unseen in North America and in Europe, where, however, the resistance is slightly lower for obvious reasons. The other reason of this was simply that that politically, I think we have been such a smug society. We have been so obsessed with our constitutional success that it was more convenient to not read Ambedkar than to actually read him for his warnings. And so therefore, It's only with the unraveling of democracy as a political form worldwide that we see thinkers like Ambedkar return to a certain kind of philosophical prominence.
All right, thank you. The next question is for Jyotsna, and the question is from S.R. Darapuri. And his question is intercaste marriages. Jyotsna, can you hear us? Hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So the question is intercaste marriages have always been there, though sparingly, but they have not succeeded in abolishing caste. If so, then what should be done to break the caste system?
I think it's a fairly broad question with and I mean I will try to address it, but I'm not sure if I'm like if I have enough intellectual capacity to answer that question. But I feel that of course, like I said, caste marriage has been seen as a way
Yeah,
to annihilate caste, but it's we also
Jyotsna, your voice comes and goes.
sorry. Am I audible now?
Yes.
So I was saying that, I mean, we see around us that intercaste marriage has not been able to abolish caste. And I agree with Darapuriji on that. But it's also this thing that just intercaste marriage, and I think Ambedkar says that also in Annihilation of Caste, that the marriage itself, it is, although it is one way to annihilate caste, but it is not the only way, and it is not going to probably annihilate caste completely, because there are also people who are just getting married because they fall in love, or they choose to get married to a certain person without a socio political consciousness and awareness of caste. So if people might get married in a different caste, but that necessarily does not give them a perspective, a political understanding, and what their association or alliance means. And I think it also has to be read in a political atmosphere and climate of a country, especially today, where we see this whole rise of fascism and right wing Hindutva ideology. I feel the political climate of the country doesn't allow any sort of dissent voices to exist, and so in that scenario, intercaste marriage is going to be far more complicated, far more ostracized, far more punished, because again it does create that sort of ambiguity and confusion for the state and for the identity, the social identity of the citizens, that it would have to kind of govern. So then it creates that anxiety for the government to how to kind of look at or place them in the political discourse. And I'm not sure if there is one solution of how to kind of annihilate caste, and what can be done to break the caste. But I definitely feel there is, and drawing from the discussion we were having earlier, and Professor Aishwarya and Dickens was saying, there is a need to again re-engage and read and teach Ambedkar in universities, in colleges, in like at home, at workplaces, because we also see like how Marx is being read again in contemporary times, because we're seeing the crisis, we're seeing the crisis of, we're seeing the crisis in governance, and this whole surveillance that is happening in India, in the US, and in different other countries. So I feel the marriage as an institution is also constantly impacted and influenced by the political atmosphere of a country, and where we are right now. I feel that at the moment, we just discussed the arrest of Anand Tumre and Gautam and the other activists that's been on completely on rise, there is a clear sign and indication that government does not or will not tolerate any sort of dissent anymore, and any voice that critiques the status quo, the critiques the Brahminical Hindutva ideology, will be put behind bars, will there will be a spectacle that will be made, and as a lesson for people to kind of see and get scared of. So honestly, we are heading for a big crisis, big political crisis, intellectual crisis, social crisis, economic crisis of all kinds, and that is going to be reflected in our intimate relationships, in our homes, in our human relationships of whether it's of solidarity, whether it's of love, whether it's of anything. So at the moment, I feel annihilation of caste. See, I feel we have taken, like what Ambedkar did and what they wrote. I think we have taken 100 steps back into the civilization, and I think we have to start all. I don't know. I mean, I think we have to again, which is why read Ambedkar, teach Ambedkar, and draw, like learn from the inside, because they have already given huge body of work that needs to kind of be explored and engaged with to be able to maybe chart another route for the future. Yeah, so I don't think we're going to have another Ambedkar, but we have his writings and his principles to draw from, and I think that's what we need to do at the moment. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. So we have a few more questions. I'll be taking questions only till 7 p.m. and after that we'll probably stop. So the next two questions are for Dr. Kumar, and yeah. So one question is in reference to what you had mentioned earlier. It's from Rishikesh Arvikar. He says, was the applauding of the health workers, do you think it had a different side when migrant workers were stranded? Like you said, in between urbanity and rurality and so on, how do you see the follow-up of state behavior of CAA and coronavirus at the moment? I sense that the state exercise is a triangulation of extraterritoriality, essentialism, and exceptionalism to ignore and neglect migrant labor out there on the street like in CAA. And the question after that is about, I'll do it one at a time. So, Professor Kumar.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Anjana, for reading it out. I seem to have, yeah, now I can see it. Yes, I agree. I think there is a specific kind of territoriality or notion of territoriality at work in how the migrant workers are being handled, how the lockdown, as it is called, is itself being handled. Now, one thing to remember is and to return to Ambedkar, one thing to remember about this movement is that much of it, the way the state, or rather the way the government actually navigates these moments of crises, have something very, very fundamental to do with the structure and the framework of neoliberal capital. That is to say, the economy has a fundamental bearing on how labor is treated, especially migrant labor. And this goes to the heart of the development, firstly the emergence, but also the development of what we call government itself, right? So there are two things that we see at work in what you are calling essentialism. One is the use of discipline. And this use of discipline is not something that is in its visible form or in its identifiable form, democratic or modern by nature. It is a discipline of a very ritualized form of conduct. The idea that you light lamps, that you have some sort of a Diwali, or you burst and then you end up bursting firecrackers. The idea that you spread absolutely groundless facts about what can happen when you fight COVID or the virus on a moonless night, and so on. So all of that marks a certain return, as I was calling it, the return of the archaic. The caste system is so profoundly successful in insinuating itself into forms of modern governmentality precisely because it can return in newer forms. It can return to us in newer forms all the elements that we thought we had left behind. This is not a story of incomplete modernity. This is a story of how technology, when it becomes a tool of discipline, returns something of a completely archaic core to our political present. And that is what I think these majoritarian or fascist or populist governments, whatever we may call them, for the lack of a proper or accurate word for them, these governments are so successful. They are successful because at the heart of this disenchantment with democracy, where the middle class, the urban majority believes that it has lost out when actually it has gained the most from neoliberal capitalism, then returns to ritualized form of conduct in a way that reminds you of 20th century fascisms. So there's that is something like an essentialism, but with a new sort of phenomenology, with a new sort of politics of gestures, of rituals, of liturgies, of even sacrifice. All of that brought together in a new technique of government. The second, which you would call rightly, I think, and very astutely, extraterritoriality, is what I think to be the central problematic that Ambedkar sees in Indian conception of government. And by this, he does not mean the modern Indian system of government. He means any government that is contaminated in advance by the caste system. And that he calls the problem of management of populations. Jyotsna has already talked about endogamy, so we have a very, very strong background right now in what he really means. He means that in the end, the caste system is an apparatus for management of populations. And if it is true that we became modern when governmentality moved from ritualized discipline to management of population, when sovereignty moved from the right to give someone death on to the right to make someone live, we make the poor live. We don't let them die. We abandon them. We let them perish. We dispose them. But this disposability does not come with an easy death. This disposability comes with the right of modern governments, of democratic governments, to force these people to live. So a lockdown, and then hundreds of them will start walking or trekking back through the countryside and the national highways back to where they think they came from. And even there, they would find themselves homeless again or without employment. What you see here is a new paradigm of management of population. And what is interesting, and I do not use this word casually, what is prophetic about Ambedkar is that he sees that at some point, no matter how robust our democracy is, and he knows that it is a very, very fragile democracy, no matter how rigorous our constitutionalism is, and he knows that our constitutionalism too is absolutely imperiled, we will in the end up with a nation not of citizens but of populations. And in some ways, the word populism, as I define it, is the making of the citizen or the reduction of the citizen to populations. That is what I think you see currently currently happening. Um, India is rife for quarantining because India has always known how to quarantine. And that is the tragedy that today these governments worldwide have arrogated to themselves the extra constitutional and extra judicial right to lock down or quarantine entire populations when actually, in the name of liberty, when actually they have always done it by other names. Caste would be that other name. And that is why you see um, uh, the government of India's remarkable success in the urban areas in getting people or persuading people to believe that this is actually a flawless exercise of or a flawless commitment to our health, when it is actually simply the effort to make us or force us to live.
All right. Thank you. Next, we have two more questions. So one is for Ms. Siddharth, and it's from Amisha Gautam. She's asks, do you think there is a legal deterrent to intercaste marriages as the child borrows caste only from the father and not from the mother, except in special circumstances? So if a scheduled caste woman marries an upper caste male, is there a fear of losing affirmative action?
Actually, this question is interesting because there isn't, there isn't, because government has launched the scheme to incentivize intercaste marriage. So the government gives you say a 25,000 or a certain amount for an intercaste couple to get married as a form of incentive. So it's, but at the same time, what government doesn't do is to protect the intercaste couples from violence, from any sort of ostracization. And what it doesn't do is that it doesn't safeguard the rights of intercaste couple. So on one hand, you see the legal aspect where you have the scheme. On the other hand, there is no protection and safeguard for the couple. So um so I mean, like, the discussion that we've been having, it is pretty clear that it is not in the government's interest to promote intercaste marriage. Of course, there is a certain legal binding, and thank you to the constitution that we have and the kind of vision it has, the kind of rights it gives to the people. Government is forced to acknowledge those variation and plethora of desires or expectations that the citizens might have from its government. But having left to the government alone, I don't think it is in their interest to promote these kind of alliances and associations. And of course, we have patriarchy, and the institution of marriage itself is very heteronormative and patriarchal, that the as soon as the child is born, they are given the surname of the father, and hence the caste reproduces itself, even though the idea of intercaste marriage is to break that boundary and to break that walls of caste. It reproduces itself, and I think Professor Aishwary has already elaborated on the tool of governmentality and disciplining, that it is not seeing people as citizens, as people having intellectual, social, political abilities to. It sees people as very passive and not. I mean, there is the fact that Modi comes on the national television every month and give task to the people. I think it's also a very submissive way, or in the way the population is being treated, that the task has to be ascribed to the population as a way to distract them from the ongoing political activities that the government is engaging in, or the challenges and barriers that government is not able to confront or does not want to confront. So what it does is, every few days you see there is this whole display um, of solidarity and display of by the government to uphold the unity, while at the same time it does not protect the minorities, it does not protect the marginalized, it does not protect women. So I feel there is that dichotomy, and that is existing together. And um, and in a way that to kind of see population as a people of the country as these passive agents that one has to constantly ask or give, but it's never seen as this mutual process where government should and must also listen to the citizens that it's kind of governing. And again, with the whole arrest of activists, we're seeing that um, government's idea of governmentality at the moment is only one, like unidirectional, very linear, and it's not open enough, like it's not broad enough to encompass the complexities and the inequities and the nuances and the perspectives and ideas that we have available in the country, because it doesn't acknowledge it. It doesn't see citizens as agents of change as well.
Thank you. Somebody has to mute their mic. It's really loud, and it's not one of the speakers. It's not my mic either. So somebody whose mic is unmuted. All right. Okay. Arpita Biswas has to mute her mic. All right. Yeah. Okay. The last question, as of what we have, is also for Professor Aishwary Kumar. It's from Payal Puri. She says, you say that Ambedkar is one of the greatest non-Western thinkers on violence and politics. Does he find something peculiar or particular about Indian violence, or does he see all political violence as inherently having a unified character?
Yeah, I think this lets us articulate some of the running threads in the discussion. Thanks, Payal, for your question. There are two things I will say here. One that also connects to I think Reni's question about how to read Ambedkar as a philosopher and how he's read. And why he was resisted for so long, which is something very specific also to do with his critique of violence, as I call it. For the longest time, it has been argued by civilizational theorists of Indian democracy, of Indian nationalism, that are by and large steeped in a certain kind of Hindu and Brahminic ethos and rhetoric, that India stands for, or India possesses a certain kind of grammar, a vocabulary, a language, a tradition of political and moral life that is entirely different from Western theories and epistemologies of political and moral life. That there's something very fundamentally or innately or irreducibly different about India. But they stop there. And one of the things that Ambedkar so radically deconstructs is not simply this theory of Indian difference, as if India had something very different from other parts of the world, as if people of India had a very different universe of desires, of lust, of love, as Jyotsna was saying, or of interest, of commerce, of passion, of profit, and of freedom, of justice. What he wanted to understand was, if this is right, if people like Savarkar, if people like Tilak, if people like Vivekanand, if people like Gandhi were actually so right that India had a very distinctive conception of moral and political collective existence, what is it that makes it so distinctive? And that is where his critique of violence makes its first breach with Indian conceptions of thinking about these questions, which is that what is distinctive about India is a particular system, an enduring system of invisible violence, a system in which you can violate entire swaths of populations without ever feeling the guilt of having done so. It's that sort of dialectic between absolute oppression and complete guiltlessness that the caste system makes possible. Now, it has been argued that Ambedkar's critique of violence was simply a critique of caste violence, and that is not really the heart of the matter. The heart of Ambedkar's thinking of violence and the relationship between politics and violence is its, what I was saying, unitary character, but with one important caveat, which is that while violence is universal, while the temptation to violence is universal, what is interesting about India is its theory and its practice of violence has something exemplary about it. That India is marked in its propensity to violence not by its difference from other European, American, English conceptions and practices of violence. India is not marked by difference in how it violates. India is exemplary in how it violates. That in the end, all systems of violence on the planet, and this is planetary because he says, when the Hindu leaves his country and leaves and sails across the 7 seas, he takes his caste with him. The Hindu does not lose his caste, as it was often rumored. The Hindu actually entrenched himself further in his caste and took it overseas. And that planetary critique, or perhaps that planetary affinity for a system of violence, is exemplarily Indian. The relationship between violence and politics is universal. But the Indian way of forging a relationship between violation and democracy, between cruelty and democracy or politics, is exemplary. That in the end, it is not simply a violence that makes India different from other countries. India has a system of violence and violation, brutality, that is exemplary among all other other societies. And it is that exemplarity, it's the critique of exemplarity that rips Ambedkar apart from all other ways of thinking about Indian political life. And in the end, what he offers truly is not simply a phenomenology, not simply our everyday hesitations in touching and not touching. What he gives us in the end, I think, is a proper moral psychology of violence. Why is it that we are compelled to cruelty? Why is it that we are compelled to meanness? And meanness is simply, what is meanness? Meanness is cruelty in language. To say something mean is to simply violate someone in language with no purpose, no end. In the end, what is our snobbery, this urban, Brahminic, caste-ridden snobbery? other than our method of reminding others that we are their masters. In that sense, what Ambedkar is himself exemplary of is a theory and a critique of violence that puts our ordinary everyday vices at the center of political philosophy. That think about those little things, those anonymous acts that bring glory, but think about those ordinary violations, things like snobbery and hypocrisy, meanness and cruelty, and even hesitation, that actually give Indian violence and Indian systems of violence their most invisibly brutal form. And in that invisible brutality, India is exemplary. Although violence is universal, India stands apart in its ability to violate.
All right. Thank you so much to all the speakers. Those are all the questions we have. Just a quick announcement before we wrap things up. Lamakaan will be organizing a series of events in the next coming few days. Tomorrow, there is a parenting workshop on how to constructively engage with children during a lockdown. This is being held by Sami Sani. And then on 17th, there'll be an event which deals with the corona pandemic in India. And this will deal with fake news, misinformation, making the rounds. The talk will be, the speaker for the evening will be Anup Bhuya. And we hope all of you will join us for future events. And for any further details, please check our Facebook page and Lamakaan's website. But thank you all for coming. I thank you so much to all the three speakers for taking out your time, being a part of this session. We had a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjana, for organizing this. And again, to everyone at Lamakaan, to Farhan, to Ilahi, to Humaira, thank you for having me again. It's a real honor.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.